1861, and the political atmosphere of the United States is reaching a boiling point over the issue of slavery. The narrow election of Abraham Lincoln has sparked a secessionist movement before he's even taken the oath of office. On a 13-day trip from Illinois to the nation's capital, a deadly plot to assassinate the president-elect is already underway.
There are rumors that he will be shot, stabbed, or that his train will be blown up.
These are the moments that could have forever changed history. I'm John Horrigan, and this is Assassination. The presidential election of 1860 was a hard-fought battle that pitted Northern Republican Abraham Lincoln against three other candidates, all of whom were in support of slavery. And while Lincoln had won the election, it was by no means a majority, with less than 40% of the popular vote going his way.
There were many in the South who felt that the election of Lincoln was a threat to their way of life, and the only way to address this threat was to get rid of Lincoln.
Unfortunately for Lincoln, no single railway line could carry him from Illinois to Washington. He would have to travel on 18 different lines, covering over 2,000 miles, mainly through northern states. But in order to get to D.C., he would have to travel through one slave-holding state, Maryland.
In Maryland, Lincoln's train would dip down below the Mason-Dixon line for the first time, and there was a very real chance that Maryland would secede from the Union before the train even got there. And in that case, Washington, D.C. would be entirely hemmed in by Confederate territory.
Lincoln, however, decided to make a series of public appearances across the northern half of the nation on what would be called his whistle-stop tour.
The whistle-stop tour was Lincoln's way of offering calming words to the North and extending a hand of reconciliation to the South. Lincoln hoped that he could use this opportunity to pull the nation back from the brink of civil war.
But using this form of transportation was fraught with many challenges, including the security of its cargo, Lincoln himself. You see, Lincoln had made his scheduled itinerary available to the public in order to make himself more accessible.
There wasn't the kind of presidential security as we understand it today. If you wanted to know where Lincoln was going to be, all you had to do was look at the paper.
And on top of that, Lincoln was now receiving more threatening letters in the mail, but he refused a military escort, thereby further increasing his vulnerability on the tour.
He had been very careful to avoid the appearance of taking a military posture towards the South. He didn't want anyone, much less people in the states that had already seceded, to think that he saw them as enemy combatants.
A portion of the railway that was to be used on the journey was owned by Samuel Morse Felton, president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad.
Felton was hearing all sorts of rumors coming from the South about an attack on his railroad, particularly at the bridges. If these bridges could be taken down, it would prevent the movement of troops and supplies, so he was very concerned about any talk of a threat against it.
Felton knew there was only one person to call, Allan Pinkerton.
Allan Pinkerton was a celebrated detective, and he was particularly known for offering protection to the railroads. The idea of policing the railroads was not yet something they were doing out of Washington, so Pinkerton stepped in and created an agency that would do it.
On January 21st, Felton hired Pinkerton to travel the length of his railroad to uncover the truth behind these threats.
Felton knew that whatever danger was coming, it was likely to happen as Lincoln made his way towards Washington. That didn't leave a lot of time in which to work.
So in order for Pinkerton to cover such a vast distance, he started moving southward along the rail line, placing agents at various cities along the way. Pinkerton's concern soon focused on Baltimore, a city filled with radical secessionists ready to revolt.
All you had to do was walk down the street. People were saying outrageous things, making outrageous threats, and most of them were crackpots. It wouldn't have come to anything. But as Pinkerton knew, and as we all know now, it only takes one person with a gun.
And so he brought a team of highly trained agents to Baltimore to gather more intelligence. Joining him was Agent Harry Davies, whose knowledge of the South and its rebel factions made him uniquely qualified for the job.
Davies was a very useful guy to have around. He was widely traveled, well-educated, he was enormously charismatic, and he had also lived a considerable part of his life in the South and could easily pass as a Southern gentleman.
Also among the team was Kate Warren, the nation's first female detective and Pinkerton's most trusted operative.
Kate Warren was an incredibly valuable part of Pinkerton's team. She was persuasive, she was very, very intelligent. She could go places and become a part of conversations among women that none of the others could do.
Upon their arrival in Baltimore, they adopted new identities and fanned out across the city. Davies posed as a merchant from New Orleans and stayed at the Barnum Hotel, a secessionist hotbed teeming with gentlemen of the slaveholding aristocracy.
To the south.
Davies let it be known that he was sympathetic to the Southern cause, but he wasn't able to get his hands on anything concrete until he met Otis Hillard. And if every chain has a weak link, Otis Hillard was the weak link of this conspiracy.
Hillard was a South Carolinian who maintained many relationships with the wealthy Southerners at the hotel, and he openly displayed his secessionist pride by wearing a gold palmetto, a symbol for a pro-slavery group of militants.
Davies just sensed that if he kept at it, he was going to be able to get the information he needed. The only question was, would he have enough time?
For the next several days, the two were inseparable, and Davies continuously pressed Hillard for more information.
Hillard kept dropping breadcrumbs, and Davies began to piece together the outlines of a particular plot that was coming to the boil, specifically to mount an attack on Lincoln as he passed through Baltimore.
Across town, Pinkerton rented an office and disguised himself as a Southern stockbroker in order to get to know the local businessmen who might be bankrolling a plot. And one in particular caught his attention.
In the office next to him was a man named James Luckett. Luckett let it be known that he was a sympathizer with the Southern cause, and at one point, Pinkerton pulled out his wallet and said, "I'm sure you will know how to best spend this in the cause of Southern rights."
And with that, he had gained Luckett's trust, who then revealed his knowledge of the National Volunteers and their mission to promote the Southern cause. He then invited Pinkerton to meet their leader, Cipriano Ferrandini.
Pinkerton was well aware of Ferrandini. It was a name that you heard around town. He ran a barber shop in the basement of Barnum's Hotel. He was a fiery rebel. He could always be counted on to know the latest gossip. Even John Wilkes Booth was known to turn up at Barnum's Hotel once in a while.
Pinkerton jumped at the opportunity to meet Ferrandini that very night.
Pinkerton said afterwards that Ferrandini had been so charismatic, he said, even I had trouble keeping my mind balanced against him because what he said was just so persuasive, and he was struck by the way that all the people around him hung on his every word.
Ferrandini vowed that Lincoln would never be president and assured him that a plan had already been set in motion. Pinkerton was stunned. The plot to assassinate Lincoln was real.
Once Pinkerton realizes that there's actually a threat against Lincoln, then the clock is really ticking. Pinkerton has only 13 days to uncover hard evidence before the clock runs out.
The next day, Pinkerton and Davies started putting the pieces together, and they concluded that once Lincoln's train arrived in Baltimore, the president-elect would be left exposed and vulnerable while being transported from the Calvert station to the Camden station.
In order to get from one train station to the next, Lincoln was going to have to wade through a crowd, and Pinkerton believed that there would be a fight staged to draw any police or other escorts away from Lincoln's side. And in that moment, Lincoln would be alone and relatively unprotected, and then the fatal blow would be struck.
Pinkerton ordered Davies to continue pressing Hillard, hoping the drunkard might spill more information about the assassination attempt. And on February 18th, only 5 days before Lincoln's arrival in Baltimore, Davies made a huge breakthrough.
Hillard had been hinting that there was a secret meeting at which a group of conspirators would hatch a plot against Lincoln. And Davies pushed as hard as he dared to be invited to that meeting. And Hillard said, "Oh, it's impossible." And it looked as if Davies had blown it.
But Davies brought the information to Pinkerton, who urged him to find a way into the meeting. And so he went back to Hillard and proclaimed that he would love the chance to immortalize himself.
Hillard came back and said, "I've spoken to the others. It's all right. We can bring you to the meeting." And for Davies, this was the big break.
Later that night, Hillard escorted Davies to the secret meeting, where they joined the band of would-be assassins. And after Davies was sworn in, Ferrandini disclosed the deadly plot to assassinate Lincoln. They would distract the police at Calvert Station, leaving Lincoln defenseless, which was precisely what Pinkerton feared.
Ferrandini gave a speech telling them of what must happen and how Lincoln must be prevented from assuming the presidency.
Lincoln shall never be president. Who shall do the deed?
He revealed a red ballot and proclaimed that whomever drew it would live in infamy.
One by one, with great solemnity, they lined up, they dipped their hands into this ballot box, they pulled out a folded slip of paper, and the person who drew the red ballot was the man who had been given the honor of striking the fatal blow against President-elect Lincoln. No one was to know who drew the red ballot, and in this way, the identity of the honored patriot, as they called him, would be protected until the last minute.
Afterwards, Davies and Hillard confessed to each other that neither had drawn the red ballot. But then Hillard blurted out that Ferrandini had rigged the selection.
What they didn't know was that instead of one red ballot in the box, there were 8. If one person lost his nerve, or even 2, somebody would be certain to step forward and attack Lincoln.
Davies was shocked. 8 executioners were now roaming the streets of Baltimore, waiting to strike the fatal blow.
Davies was very eager to break away and report back to Pinkerton. Every hour that passed brought Lincoln's train closer to Baltimore. Whatever Pinkerton was going to do, he needed to do it quickly. And the first problem was to convince Lincoln that the danger was real.
Pinkerton went to see Kate Warren and instructed her to go to New York City immediately to rendezvous with Norman Judd, an Illinois politician traveling with Lincoln. He gave her a note addressed to Judd, which requested a face-to-face meeting and told her that it must not fall into the wrong hands.
Pinkerton knew that she was the perfect person for this job because of her powers of persuasion, and he trusted her absolutely.
Warren made the trip north and delivered the note to Judd, stressing that Lincoln's life was in danger. But Judd was skeptical.
It's important to realize this was all absolutely unprecedented. There had never been a presidential assassination before. It's probably fair to say that Judd was incredulous at first. And this was why it had been so important for Pinkerton to gather so much information, so many details, because they were asking everyone to believe and to take dramatic action based on the suspicion of something happening that had never happened before. And many people believed it couldn't happen.
She urged him to meet with Pinkerton, who would reveal all the details. Judd agreed to meet him in Philadelphia, and Warren headed back to Baltimore to relay the news. After hearing this, Pinkerton quickly departed, not knowing whether he could convince Lincoln that his life was in peril.
Pinkerton went to Philadelphia, and he took his information to Samuel Felton. Felton was convinced that the danger was real, and together they went to see Norman Judd, and they laid out everything they had in front of Judd.
After hearing their pleas, Judd finally relented and arranged for a private meeting where Pinkerton could speak with Lincoln directly. At last, Pinkerton would have the opportunity to warn the president-elect of the serious threat looming in Baltimore.
That night at Lincoln's hotel, Pinkerton laid out the details of the plot and all the information he had gathered, and Lincoln listened very carefully. Pinkerton wanted Lincoln to drop everything and go straight to Washington that very night. Even though Pinkerton had made his case very persuasively, Lincoln really did not want to believe that such a thing was possible. And he wanted to believe that even though people might object to his becoming president, they wouldn't go to such an extreme. In any case, he wasn't going to drop everything and abandon his itinerary. He told Pinkerton he would give him an answer in the morning. and Pinkerton saw that it was pointless to argue.
But after their meeting, Lincoln was informed by another source, Frederick Seward, that there was indeed a real danger in Baltimore. After hearing 2 independent confirmations of the threat, Lincoln was now convinced.
Lincoln is still determined to carry on with his obligations both in Philadelphia and in Harrisburg. And after that, he tells Pinkerton, "I'm in your hands, I'll do whatever you say." So Pinkerton's idea was that in order to protect Lincoln and keep him safe, he would have to pass through Baltimore ahead of schedule. The difficulty was they were going to have to get Lincoln from Harrisburg all the way to Washington in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. There was very limited time left. But Pinkerton was uniquely qualified to bring this all together.
For the first phase, they would need to escort Lincoln out of Harrisburg on a 9 p.m. train to Philadelphia. Upon arrival at the station, he would be shuffled aboard a sleeper car secured by Warren. They would then arrive at the President Street station in Baltimore in the middle of the night, where his car would be unhitched and then drawn by horse to the Camden station. It would then be coupled to another train bound for Washington and arrive hours ahead of schedule.
Pinkerton knew that what he was proposing was risky. If any word of this change of plan got out, Lincoln would be relatively alone and exposed, and surrounded by a dense and hostile crowd.
It's now Friday, February 22nd, and Lincoln has just given his consent to Pinkerton's plan. But in Philadelphia, Warren was meeting resistance from the conductor while she attempted to secure 4 adjacent compartments on the 11 p.m. train bound for Baltimore.
The problem was that when Lincoln got onto this sleeper train, anybody could come into the car. They weren't reserved seats. Kate Warren came up with a plan. She said she was traveling with her brother, who was ill, and was to be taken onto the train and not disturbed for the remainder of the journey.
After seeing the concern in Warren's eyes, the conductor consented to her request. Warren knew there was no room for error. Meanwhile, in Harrisburg, Lincoln was pulled away from his dinner with the governor. The time to act had finally arrived.
Lincoln went upstairs to his room, changed clothes, and was hustled out the back and into a waiting carriage. Lincoln, in the company of Ward Lamon, his self-appointed bodyguard, took a special train from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, where he would be met by Pinkerton.
Lincoln's last 250-mile leg to Washington had now begun. Everything was going smoothly. In fact, too smoothly. In Philadelphia, Pinkerton waited nervously at the depot, but suddenly, Lincoln's train screeched into the station a full hour ahead of schedule.
Pinkerton now found himself with a little time to kill. It wouldn't do for Abraham Lincoln to be standing around in the train station waiting. So they hustled Lincoln into a carriage, and Pinkerton gave a complicated set of directions so that they wouldn't get to the other train station until the last possible moment.
At 10:55 p.m., just minutes before the train was ready to depart, they arrived at the station and rushed Lincoln across the platform and onto the train. The transfer had worked brilliantly, and without a minute to spare, the train left for Baltimore, where the real danger still lurked.
He's taken to his sleeper compartment. There's Pinkerton, there's Lamon, there's Kate Warren, and by all accounts, Lincoln is the calmest person in the room. He's relaxed, he's cracking jokes, he's putting everyone at ease, but Pinkerton is very anxious, and at regular intervals, he walks to the back of the train, and these watchmen that Pinkerton has posted along the route are raising their lanterns to let him know the track is clear, everything is okay. But Pinkerton is on edge the whole way. If anything goes wrong, it's his head.
At 3:30 a.m., they finally arrived in Baltimore at the President Street Depot, a dangerous entry point into a city rife with contempt.
The city is sleeping, everything is quiet. At this point, Kate Warren leaves the train and goes back to her hotel in Baltimore. Pinkerton wanted her to resume what she had been doing before. It was vitally important for him to know what was being said in Baltimore, what was going on, what the mood was, and particularly what the reaction was going to be when it was discovered that Lincoln had passed through already.
But the most treacherous part of the journey was still in front of them, as they had to reach the Camden Street Depot, the only rail line connecting Baltimore to Washington, D.C.
From the beginning, the problem with Baltimore had been that the train didn't pass directly through. This added A whole extra layer of complication to Lincoln's journey. Under Pinkerton's plan, this sleeper car had to be taken off the tracks, hitched up to horses, and drawn through the streets of Baltimore to the other train station where it would be hooked up to another train that would carry it the rest of the way to Washington.
The moon was half full, and the cobblestone streets of Baltimore were desolate as the sound of creaky wheels echoed off the cold brick buildings.
According to some accounts, you can hear people outside whistling Dixie. It's driving the point home that if the sun comes up, they're going to find Abraham Lincoln sitting here in the train, relatively alone and exposed.
When they finally got to the station, it was 4:30 a.m. People were now arriving, and dawn was quickly approaching.
They were almost home free, but the train hadn't arrived yet. Pinkerton's plan had depended on the trains running like clockwork, and that morning they did not run like clockwork. The sky is starting to brighten, and the mood inside the sleeper car is getting very tense. Pinkerton is incredibly anxious because there's a very real chance that all of Pinkerton's plan is going to fall apart, and Lincoln is going to be discovered sitting there in the middle of Baltimore, pretty much alone and unprotected. And if word gets out, it could be a disaster.
Suddenly, they heard a commotion outside. Pinkerton looked through the window, expecting to see an unruly mob approaching. But instead, to his surprise, rail workers had already coupled Lincoln's car to the Washington-bound train. Amazingly, it had arrived without them knowing it. In a matter of minutes, the train rolled out of the station. And at 6 a.m. on Saturday, February 23, 1861, Abraham Lincoln arrived safely in Washington, D.C. The Baltimore Plot had been averted. Later that morning in Baltimore, Davies accompanied Hillard to the intended assassination site. But rumors of Lincoln's arrival to the capital had already hit the streets.
When people realized that Lincoln wasn't coming, there was a huge amount of disbelief, and then there was a great deal of scorn heaped on Lincoln. Not only in Baltimore, but all across the country, north and south. He was branded a coward. He had slipped through the city like a thief in the night. He wasn't fit to be president. But in the end, his reputation would have to take the hit because the danger was real.
Despite the negative public opinions that were circulating, Lincoln would go on to take the oath of office and become the 16th president of the United States of America. Later, a government committee investigated the alleged organizations behind the conspiracy, but no one was ever prosecuted.
For Lincoln, this episode was not something he wanted to spend any time dwelling on. He had given great offense to the people of Baltimore, and he wanted to move past it because Lincoln still believed that he could pull the nation back from the brink of civil war.
The details of the Baltimore Plot remained concealed for decades until Allan Pinkerton wrote about his exploits and the defining moment he safely brought Abraham Lincoln to the nation's capital. I informed Mr. Lincoln in Philadelphia that I would answer with my life for his safe arrival in Washington, and I redeemed my pledge.